move on to the export module. Now, to go over a couple tutorials on the export module, what I'm going to do is actually take some clips from my Understanding Exports class. And we're going to do about 10 or 15 minutes of this. There'll be 2 parts, so take a look at it and we'll do the question and answers after each section, all right? All right, so I've opened up my sample database, and on the left-hand side, you'll see the export module. It's right under the query. When you go there, let's start by creating a new export, and let's go over what you have to pick to begin with. Now, when you create an export, you are in essence grabbing fields from records, and you're going to make an external file. And what I mean by an external file is you'll make a comma-separated value. Maybe it's a word merge file. You might even be making a source file for a custom Crystal report. Whatever your intent, the export module is what you'll do. But you start by basically picking what kind of export are you going to create here. And a common one is a constituent export. So we'll just automatically start with that there. And then you'll see here where it says export format. Do you see this? Well, this drop-down window gives you a huge range of options. Now, the most common you will see is something like a CSV. Now, this is a comma-separated values. It's basically what any Excel program would open. You're probably very familiar with that. Another one would be this option where it says Blackbaud Report Writer Database. If you were using the file that you would be creating as a source file for a Crystal report, that's the option you choose. And again, you also have a plethora of choices. If you just scroll down, take a look. You can do it as an Excel file. You can make an Access database. Pretty much whatever your needs are, you can be met here. I'm going to just, for this purpose, I'm going to go create a CSV file, just so you can see what it looks like and see sort of how the export module works. Now, this box right here where it says Include Header, right? Now, that will make the very first row of your export be the field names, and it's always a handy thing to do that, and you'll see why. All right, so let's go to Create Now. And now this window that you see is probably looks a lot like other windows you've had, like a query, for instance, but it's only 2 tabs. You start with a General tab, and the first thing you would identify is the list of who you're creating this export for. Now, let me explain a little bit about the fields and what you're actually generating when you're doing an export. All right, so to explain a little bit more, I'm going to open a sample record here. This is Michael Garrett. It's a typical constituent record in the database. And what I want you to note is that on his record, there are basically fields that are populated. Whatever you're keeping track of, things like name, address, phone number. And if you look across the top of the record, wherever there is a check mark on a tab, it means that there's data. Now, when you have data on a record, and you want to export it into an external file, what basically is happening is Razor's Edge will take this file, and when you create a list of constituents, or if you're just doing for one constituent, it'll create a bunch of fields that it's going to export, and you're going to identify what fields go. So let's say in our example, we wanted to take things like the last name. Maybe we'll add the first name. We'll do gender. We can do birth date, maybe spouse name. Now, really, we can put as many fields as we want, and we can get very elaborate with our choices. For instance, if we wanted to export gifts, we can limit only gifts of certain dollar ranges, or only certain funds or certain campaigns. But for this purpose, let's just start simple. So when you take fields from a record, what will happen now is that the export module pretty much turns it into a grid, just like you would if you were going to be exporting to an Excel file. And the very first row is that header row. It'll tell you last name, first name, gender, birth date, spouse, etc. And when it creates this file, whether it's for one record or whether it's for a list, you would then have a populated Excel file that you can use for any other purpose. All right, so to continue with our example of exporting data for just one record, when I have a new export open, right here, this button that says Include is where I will identify if I'm doing it for all records, selected records, which means I will pick a query of constituents, or just one record. And let's use the Michael Garrett example. And there he is. And when I say Open, it will say one record, Michael Garrett. Now, just like in Mail or in Query, you have the ability of doing things like head of household processing or include these constituents. These are those quick check boxes that you can turn on or off in the event that you want to exclude groups of people. For instance, if you wanted all the deceased people not to be exported, you can just uncheck that. You see how this works?
Now the second tab here where it says output is where you will identify the actual fields that you're creating for your file. Now on the left hand side is basically all the fields that are tracked on any record. So let's open up the constituent information, and I'm going to go down and we're going to grab the fields I just showed you in my grid. So we'll say last name, and I can bring it over in multiple ways. I can just highlight it and pull it over. I can highlight it and hit the select button here. Remember, Razor's Edge is notorious for having lots of redundant fields. I think what else we had is a birth date. So we'll put that over. We also had gender. I think gender might have even been before that, but it doesn't matter. Now remember, on export, you can actually change the order of the fields by highlighting any of them, and you'll see these up and down arrows, so I can move them up or down or around however I see fit. And then I think we also had the spouse name, so you'll see spouses available here as a subsection. Remember, just like in query, wherever you see a plus sign to the left, it means it can expand. So anything that has a plus sign, you can click it, it will expand. If you click it again, it will collapse. You see how that works? So let's go down and find spouse name. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this file so you can see what it looks like. By hitting the export button down here, this button here, or the same result if you hit this button that looks like an arrow pointing to a CD, it'll give you the option of identifying where you want to save the file. Now I'm just going to put it on my desktop here, and I'm going to call it sample export. And now notice the type, it says saved as CSV, I say okay, and when it does it, it'll tell me one row exported because we're only doing one record, right? Now let's peek at what this file looks like. Any of you who have had any experience with Excel will see, here's what it looks like. So this is basically a header row. It lists the actual technical field name, so we have last name, first name, gender, birth date, and spouse name. And because we don't have a birth date on his record, it comes out blank. But this is exactly how export works. You can create a list or a group or whatever it might be, and you can create an Excel file that you can then use for what other purposes. Maybe you're creating a report. Maybe you're creating a list that you're going to use somewhere else. Whatever it might be, this is the robust, powerful tool called export.